Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 148, Imperial Swansong. The consequences of Henry VII's campaign in Italy. Also, episode 11 of season 8, the Holy Roman Empire from the Interregnum to the Golden Bull. The year is 1312, and Henry VII is finally embarking on his journey to Rome that will bring about the first imperial coronation in almost a century and hence the formal end to the Interregnum, the time without emperors. Becoming emperor is hard enough, but being emperor is even harder, as the first Luxemburger to ascend the throne of Charlemagne will find out. Hope for an end to the incessant civil wars in Italy lay buried under the rotting corpses before Brescia. Henry VII is no longer a unifying figure in Italy. He's just simply the leader of the Ghibelline faction. And as such, he had to tackle the Guelphs, led by the commune of Florence and King Robert of Naples. And doing that triggered a domino effect that not only left him dead, but also reopened the ancient struggle between the Pope and the Emperor, now with a new je ne sais quoi mixed in. Sounds ominous? Come along and find out. But before we start, let me remind you that the History of the Germans podcast is advertising free, a privilege we enjoy thanks to the generosity of our patrons. And you can become a patron too, either by signing up at patreon.com/historyofthegermans or by making a one-time donation at historyofthegermans.com/support. And let me thank Martin B., Stephen Wild, Bree P., Britta DK, Brian JR, and Colleen D., who've already signed up. And with that, back to the show. Last week we left Henry VII in Genoa, severely shaken by the death of his wife, the Queen Margarete, who had been his support and counsel throughout his career. Having lost her, his younger brother, the knightly Valram, and 2/3 of his army, his campaign was now in a sorry state. His enemies, the alliance of Guelph cities in Tuscany and Romagna, led by Florence, and King Robert of Naples, have blocked all possible land routes to Rome. And to Rome is where he needed to go, to be crowned emperor as Pope Clement V had promised he would be. Still, Genoa received him with all the honours of an emperor. Not only that, they found themselves so riven with conflict that they submitted themselves entirely to the emperor's control. He was made podesta of the city for 20 years. And Henry VII took his mandate of reconciling the warring families of Genoa, the Spinola and the Doria, very seriously. But however serious one takes these attempts, they were ultimately futile. The conflicts were so deeply entrenched and overlaid with commercial rivalry, they could, and they did, go on for centuries. Despite his attempt at reconciliation remaining fruitless, he still demanded the now customary payment of 60,000 gold florins for the service. Initially, the commune agreed, but they soon noticed that there wasn't much value for money here, and so payments came in much more slowly. Meanwhile in Lombardy, as one would have expected, the imperial position contracted sharply after Henry VII had left. Effectively, only the Della Scala in Verona and the Visconti of Milan stayed loyal to the imperial cause. Henry VII had appointed Werner von Homberg as his representative for Lombardy, and had given him as many soldiers as he could spare. And then he asked him to do the impossible, and convince the Lombards by whichever means possible to come back into the fold. Now you may know Werner von Homberg from the Codex Manesse, where he is depicted in one of the most famous images. Or you may know him for his role in Swiss history. But in 1312 he worked for Henry VII, trying to rustle up some cash from the Italian cities. But as it happened, whatever funds he managed to extract he needed to pay his own forces. So, not much, if any, money came down to the imperial camp in Genoa. The departure of the Count of Homberg had also reduced the already much diminished imperial army. Those who stayed were now far and few between. There was his brother, Archbishop Baldwin of Trier. There were the 2 counts of Flanders, a third of them had already perished, the bishops of Liège and Geneva, and Amadeus of Savoy and his family. These were his remaining loyal supporters. Many men were still dying from the disease they had picked up during the siege of Brescia. Of the dozens of Lombard noblemen he had ordered to accompany him, only 2 were still with him, a minor member of the Visconti plus 1 more, in total adding just a few knights to his forces. At the same rate as his supporters slipped out of the camp, did the creditors fill his hall, demanding payment. But money there was none. Moreover, the Genoese also noticed that since the arrival of the emperor and his men, mortality had gone through the roof. Whatever that disease was that had bred before Brescia was now infecting the Genoese. But worse, they were not only dying, they also lost trade, as the Guelphs in Tuscany and southern Italy had declared an embargo on Genoese goods. So by Christmas 1311, Henry VII had outstayed his welcome. It was time to move on. The only ally that could help him to get to Rome was Pisa. The city of Pisa had been the staunchest supporter of the Hohenstaufen and had remained unwaveringly Ghibelline all the way through the Interregnum. So to Pisa he would now head. In the early 14th century, Pisa found itself in a politically difficult position. They had always been in close competition with the other maritime republic on Italy's western shore, Genoa. But as the city of Florence had gone from strength to strength, they were now fighting a war on 2 fronts. And it was a war the Pisans weren't winning. In 1284, Genoa had inflicted a near-fatal defeat on the Pisan fleet. The wars with Florence did not go any better, though so far any major defeat had been avoided. Pisa now put all its hopes and expectations into the Emperor Henry VII, who they firmly believed had come to reverse their fortunes and smash their enemies. Hence, they were happy to send galleys to Genoa to pick the emperor up and bring him into the city of the already leaning tower. Henry VII stayed in Pisa until April 1312. His fortunes were brightening up a little bit. His camp was filling up again, this time with the exiles and disaffected of Tuscany who have been thrown out of their cities, either because they were Ghibellines or because they were white Guelphs. Even some German nobles, notably Robert, Duke of Bavaria and Count Palatinate on the Rhine, joined. The Pisans, believing that the final struggle was upon them, proved willing to bear the taxes and the costs of an imperial court in their city much more graciously than the Milanese and the Genovese have been. This was certainly good news for our Luxemburgian hero, but meanwhile news from Rome were much less promising. Rome, and you must be tired of hearing this by now, but Rome, like all the other Italian cities, was split between 2 families, one claiming to be Guelphs and the other claiming to be Ghibellines. The Ghibellines, that were the Colonna. You remember Sciarra Colonna, the guy who allegedly slapped Pope Boniface VIII in the face. The Guelphs were their rivals, the Orsini, the Bears. Both families still exist, and the Colonna Palace in Rome can be visited, something I would advise anyone travelling to the Holy City to do. It's a complete rabbit warren of room after room filled with art and ancient trinkets. And guess what? There is not a single reference to Sciarra Colonna or the events we are recounting today. Because the Colonna did regain their love for the papacy, put one of their own on the seat of St. Peter, and then forgot about their pope-slapping ancestor. On y soit qui mal y pense. But in 1312 the Colonna were very much in the imperial camp, fighting the Orsini and the Pope whenever an opportunity presented itself. Initially, this rivalry between the Colonna and the Orsini would not have been a significant issue for Henry VII's coronation. After all, Henry VII was travelling with papal blessing and had 3 cardinals in his retinue, so even the Orsini, as Guelphs, loyal servants of Pope Clement V, they should be opening the gates of the Holy City to the Emperor-elect. But something had happened in the meantime. King Robert of Naples had sent an army under the command of his youngest son into Rome to occupy key strategic positions, including the traditional site of the coronation, St. Peter's. Asked what he intended with the move, Robert's ambassadors said They only come to show their reverence for the King of the Romans, and they wanted to make sure everything was shipshape and Bristol fashion for the great event. Way back when Henry was still in Genoa, Robert had sent a delegation to negotiate some sort of agreement, if not a marriage alliance with the future emperor. But that discussion had led nowhere. And as soon as the representatives of Naples had left, a delegation from Frederick, the King of Sicily, had shown up in Henry's camp. Give us a break. Do we not have enough names in this episode? Who is this King of Sicily now? Well, the Kingdom of Sicily under the Normans and the Hohenstaufen contained both the island of Sicily and the southern Italian mainland. But in 1282, Charles of Anjou, the ruthless conqueror of the kingdom and the killer of young Conradin of Hohenstaufen, had lost the island of Sicily in a bloody uprising that came to be known as the Sicilian Vespers. Episode 93 if you're interested. Ever since, the old Norman kingdom of Sicily was divided into the kingdom of the island of Sicily, ruled by members of the Spanish dynasty of the House of Aragon, whilst the mainland became known as the Kingdom of Naples, even though its rulers still called themselves Kings of Sicily. This Kingdom of Naples was ruled by Charles' descendants, the Anjous, who were also cousins of the kings of France. You can imagine that relations between these two kings of Sicily were a touch frosty. So as soon as Frederick of the island of Sicily realized that Henry VII could get friendly with his rival in Naples, he sent him a table made from solid silver and declarations of eternal loyalty to the imperial cause. Now, a solid silver table is hard to hide, in particular not if Henry VII sold it immediately to pay his creditors. The news of the generous present reached Robert of Naples, and his position hardened against Henry VII. Hence, there are now Neapolitan soldiers in Rome. At which point Henry sent one of his allies to take charge of the Senate of Rome and his allies in the city. Once Henry had reached Pisa and it had become clear that the Ghibellines of Tuscany lent him their support, the positions overall toughened further. The alliance of Naples and the Guelph cities declared in early April that their main objective was now to prevent the coronation of Henry VII in Rome. To achieve that objective, an anti-imperial force began congregating in Rome. Florence sent 200 knights. King Robert's marshal brought a further 300 armoured riders plus 1,000 infantry. Lucca sent 300 cavalry and another 1,000 foot soldiers. Siena, 200 horse and 600 on foot, and so forth and so forth. By May 21st, the Guelph army had assembled in the Holy City and had occupied the key strongholds: the Capitoline Hill, the Castel San Angelo, St. Peter's, and the Palace of the Vatican. In turn, the Colonna, the supporters of Henry VII, had fortified their positions around the Lateran Palace, the Colosseum, Santa Maria Maggiore, and Santa Sabina. Everything was building up to a final showdown, a battle for the imperial crown to be fought inside the city of Rome. Meanwhile, Henry VII had followed the coastline down from Pisa until he reached the territory of Siena. The Sienese had sent much of their forces down to Rome, and the remaining soldiers inside the city were too disunited to dare an attack. So Henry was able to pass through Tuscany with his rather modest force as just 400 men, unopposed. He reached Viterbo on May 1st, 1312, and shortly afterwards appeared before Rome. He entered the city by fighting his way across the Milvian Bridge, where Constantine had fought the famous battle against Maxentius that led to his conversion to Christianity. In 1312, the fighting on the Milvian Bridge turned out not to be the decisive battle, just a foretaste of things to come. Henry was now inside Rome, and the population of the neighbourhoods controlled by the Colonna received him enthusiastically. He took up residence in the Lateran Palace and the next day convened a council of war. The imperial position on the left bank of the Tiber was strong and solid, but what they needed was access to St. Peter's on the other side of the river. St. Peter was the coronation church of the empress, and that was the church the cardinals insisted they needed to perform a valid coronation. The only way to get there was by urban combat, to first get to the Tiber Bridge and then across the bridge past Castel Sant'Angelo, the former mausoleum of the Emperor Hadrian and Rome's preeminent defensive structure, and then uphill to the Vatican. Over the next month, the skirmishes between the imperial forces and the Guelphs turned the center of Rome into a slaughterhouse. The imperial forces had to break one fortified townhouse after the other. Some, like the Torre delle Milizie, the largest medieval tower that still stands today above Trajan's Forum, was taken by hijacking the brother of its defender. Others, like the Capitoline Hill, had to be broken into by force. Often the soldiers, unfamiliar with the warren of streets in Rome, lost contact with their main force and were killed on the spot. After weeks of fighting, the imperial forces had broken through, and then stood before the bridge that leads to the Castello di Sant'Angelo. The Bishop of Liège, Henry's cousin and a great warrior, attacked the bridge defences and almost got through. What he failed to notice, though, was that the enemy had gathered forces out of the way in the Campo dei Fiori, who broke forth, attacking his flank. Henry then brought more of his forces to bear to relieve his cousin, as did the Neapolitans and the Orsini. Soon a full-on battle involving the entirety of both armies raged inside the densely populated city quarter around the bridge of Sant'Angelo. Not a battle in the conventional sense, but a huge fight man against man, as Giorgio Villani wrote, a combat without a plan and any kind of structure. Everyone hit out at the enemy at whichever spot fate had put him. This melee lasted for hours before Henry VII finally called for a retreat. The Bishop of Liège was captured, and whilst he was led away unarmed, one of the soldiers of the King of Naples, who had lost his brother in the fighting, plunged his sword into the bishop's stomach. He was brought into the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he died shortly afterwards. Henry and his council concluded that, despite their success in clearing the Guelphs from their side of the Tiber, taking the Castello di Sant'Angelo and the Vatican was simply impossible. The enemy was strong, and the defences even stronger. And the emperor was at a huge strategic disadvantage. For the Guelphs to achieve their objective of preventing an imperial coronation, all they had to do was to block the way to St. Peter's, and they could do that from their near impregnable castle on the bridge. Whilst Henry VII had to attack these fortresses in the open, a process, even if it were achievable, was incredibly costly in terms of men and material. So the only way to still effect a coronation was therefore a change of venue. If the cardinals were willing to crown the emperor elsewhere, for instance in the Lateran Basilica, a church the Emperor Constantine had built for the bishops of Rome around the same time as St. Peter's, and almost equal in size, well, that would reduce the enemy's advantage to naught. Henry VII's legal team wrote a learned treatise arguing a coronation in the Lateran Church was a viable option under both canon and imperial law, and they presented their proposal to the three cardinals. The cardinals who had taken up residence in the Torre delle Milizie did not concur. They insisted on St. Peter's as the only suitable location for a coronation. All they offered was to write to the Orsini and the Neapolitans demanding in the name of Pope Clement V that they cease hostilities and make St. Peter's available for the coronation. Response to that came none. The cardinals then wrote to Pope Clement asking him to tell the Guelphs to please respond to the letter. Now, even assuming a letter from Clement V would have an effect, that letter would take weeks to get to Avignon and then weeks to come back. When Henry VII demanded what they should do in the meantime, the answer was no St. Peter's, no imperial crown. Meanwhile, the vicious street fighting continued all across Rome, very much to the annoyance of the population. How were they supposed to live a normal life when they risk getting stabbed every time they leave the house? The people of Rome congregated in the square below in the Capitol to ask exactly this question, and one of Henry's loyal supporters, Niccolo de Bonsignori, laid it out for them. The enemy positions were too strong to be taken by force. The Guelphs, though allegedly loyal to the Pope, had refused to even answer the demands of the cardinals, and therefore the demands of the Holy Father, to let the coronation proceed. And the cardinals were refusing to crown the emperor anywhere else but St. Peter's. That leaves only unusual measures, namely that everyone who had so far not declared for the emperor will be called to the eagle standards, and those who refuse will experience the wrath of war. Now, this announcement did not result in either a huge influx of supporters for Henry or disaffection of the populace with this draconian measure itself. Instead, the anger of the people directed against the cardinals. After Henry had made several further attempts at swaying the prelates' minds, the populace had enough. They gathered under the tower of the militia and threatened to kill the cardinals should they continue to refuse the coronation. Afraid for their lives, the cardinals relented. On June 29th, 1312, after 18 months of toiling in Italy, did Henry VII, King of the Romans and duly elected emperor, clad in white robes and with long flowing hair, proceed from the Aventine to St. John Lateran. During the solemn mass, the Cardinal Bishop of Ostia placed first a white mitre and then the imperial diadem on the kneeling king's head. Before receiving both the orb and the scepter, Henry VII rose up, unsheathed his sword and swung it 3 times over his head before laying it down on the altar together with his shield as a sign of his commitment to defend the church. Proceedings completed, the now Emperor Henry VII and his court sat down for a splendid dinner in the Lateran Palace, whilst the people of Rome were treated to free drink and food, following by lusty dancing. But halfway through the festivities, the new emperor was reminded of the fragility of his situation. His enemies had taken the opportunity, whilst the Imperials were at church, to capture the Aventine Hill, and from there they shot arrows and stones at the Lateran Palace, forcing everyone indoors. Over the following days, the imperial position in Rome became completely untenable. With the coronation achieved, the German vassal service had come to an end and they returned home. And it was the end of June. Already did the heat and the accompanying diseases affect Henry's forces. The Guelphs and Neapolitans kept receiving reinforcements, whilst his army dwindled. With many of his German followers gone, Henry became more and more dependent on his Tuscan supporters, the Ghibelline cities and the exiles from the Guelph cities. His followers in Lombardy, the Visconti and the Della Scala were engaged in what is increasingly a war of conquest against Padua, Brescia, Cremona, etc. They may occasionally seek support from Werner of Homburg, the imperial governor of northern Italy, but they were basically doing their own thing. Any pretense that he would be reconciling the divisions in Italy were now gone. So it is somewhat unclear what his plans were now. He had gained the imperial crown, the original reason for his journey, so he could take his remaining supporters and return home. And going home would have made some sense. His son John had acquired the Bohemian crown, but only just. A little bit of parental/imperial support would therefore have not gone amiss. But Henry did not go home. It may have been a combination of demands from his allies, the lure of the riches of Italy, and or the sense that his rather underwhelming coronation had left him with an urge to take revenge. Who knows? As he looked round, the enemy that had thwarted his plans and had been responsible for the stiff resistance in Italy were 2. The Black Guelphs who ruled Florence and King Robert of Naples. And it's they he wanted to go after now. And as it happened, these were the same people his Italian allies were keenest to go after as well. But going after Robert of Naples was politically difficult. Robert of Naples was a cousin of the French King Philip the Handsome, who had initially been one of Henry's supporters, but had cooled considerably towards his former protege. More importantly, Robert of Naples was a vassal of Pope Clement V, and the Holy Father might get into a most unholy rage should Henry head down to Naples. So, to Florence it was. Henry VII had first retreated to Tivoli to maintain the pretense that he had not cowardly fled Rome, as the Orsini, Florentines and Neapolitans were encroaching on his position. But he did not stay long. In August he headed into Tuscany, collecting followers in the fiercely Ghibelline city of Arezzo, and on September 9th began a siege of Florence. As we said last week, in the Middle Ages, before cannons could be used to break walls, an attack on a city was only successful if the besieging army was able to surprise the defenders and break the gates before the defences can be brought into position. And since Henry VII had moved much faster than anyone expected, he could have surprised and overwhelmed the defenders had he maintained a bit more discipline in his ranks. But his largely unpaid soldiers ransacked the farms and villages along the way. So the Florentines saw the smoke of the burning farmsteads, realized that the enemy was on its way, closed the gates and armed themselves. The defenders could still muster enough forces to man the gates, even though a large part of the Florentine army had been attacked and nearly overwhelmed on their way back from Rome. Then over the subsequent days the Florentine army returned, and the other Guelph cities sent reinforcements. In the end, the defenders had an army of 4,000 knights and several thousand infantry, whilst Henry's force outside the walls counted just 1,800 armed riders. The discrepancy in numbers and the brand new fortifications of Florence turned the siege into a farce. Henry's army blocked just one gate of the city, whilst the others remained open, and trade in and out of the city continued as if there was no war at all. Whether it was the stress of the preceding months or the climate, Henry VII fell ill. But this time he recovered, and realizing that his attack on Florence was futile, withdrew first to San Casciano, then to Poggibonsi. In Poggibonsi he was surrounded by enemies, in Florence and in Siena, and then two Neapolitan forces, one in San Gimignano and another one in Colle di Valdelsa. Another blow was that one of the three counts of Flanders, who had been by the side of the emperor since the beginning, and who had lost one of his brothers in the campaign, had enough, took his remaining vassals, and left for home. The situation went from bad to dire. He abandoned Poggibonsi, and his much diminished army fought their way back into Pisa. In Pisa, loyal to the last, did Henry VII get the chance to regroup and to weigh his options. The attack on Florence had been a failure. But it was noticeable that, though the forces inside Florence had been vastly superior, they never mounted a serious attack on the imperial camp. Nor did they rout him when he was stuck in Poggibonsi. The only conceivable reason for that was the inherent fragility of these city governments. Sure, the Guelph leadership could muster a majority for a policy of sending Henry back home, but they would have found it difficult to justify defeating and even killing the emperor. That would have been a step too far for the pro-imperial factions that still existed, even in the staunchly Guelph Florence. Equally, a policy to wipe out the Guelphs in the cities, as he had attempted on occasion in Lombardy, had failed for the same reasons. Removing the heads of the Guelphs still left a Guelph faction behind in the city that would rise up as soon as the imperial army had left. So the way out of the stalemate was to finally go after the sole true territorial power in Italy, King Robert of Naples. Up until now, Henry had hesitated to go after King Robert because he did not want to jeopardize his relationship with Pope Clement V. Clement V had been crucial in him gaining the election as King of Rome in defiance of King Philip IV of France, and his invitation to be crowned in Rome had been a precondition for his journey. Now, Clement V might have liked Henry on a personal level, but that had not been the reason he supported Henry VII. What Clement V wanted was to gain some independence from the French crown. Though he no longer resided on French territory, but had moved to Avignon, technically outside France in the papal fief, but the French army still sat on the opposite shore of the Rhone, ready to seize the successor of St. Peter if the need arose. His ultimate escape route from French control had been a return to Rome. That may explain why the cardinals kept insisting that Henry should take St. Peter's. Not so much for some spiritual reason, but because they wanted Rome to be safe for a papal return. When Henry VII's attempt to gain control of Rome failed, Clement V had become a de facto prisoner in Avignon. And Clement had already made huge concessions to Philip IV when he allowed him to suppress the Order of the Templars and seize their property, which after all was church property. But he had clung to the hope that Henry could gain him Rome and a return ticket. By December 1312, that ticket had expired. At the same rate as Clement V fell under French control, did Henry VII's confidence in the Pope diminish. he had asked Clement V to excommunicate Robert of Naples for opposing the coronation, but Clement had refused, or more precisely had not dared to do that to the cousin of the French king. Therefore, when in December 1312 Henry was weighing his options, he no longer felt that he needed to make concessions to the Pope. Robert of Naples may be a papal vassal, and an attack on him would be an attack on the Pope, but then the Pope had been dragged into the enemy camp anyway. Plus, unless he unseated Robert of Naples, there was no chance he would ever gain a sustainable position in Italy, and for whatever reason, that is what he wanted. As a first step, Henry VII in his role as emperor formally convicted Robert of Naples for high treason and seized his imperial fiefs, the Kingdom of Naples and the County of Provence. Henry also entered into an alliance with King Frederick of Sicily, the arch-enemy of the Anjou and a grandson of Emperor Frederick II. Throughout the spring and summer of 1313, he gathered a huge force. Pisa was pulling out all the stops, hiring mercenaries and providing their own men. Genoa sent a fleet. Even from Germany, reinforcements arrived, drummed up by Henry's brother Baldwin, the Archbishop of Trier, who also had gone home. Meanwhile, King Frederick of Sicily was putting together an invasion force that would attack the Kingdom of Naples from the south. Historians have been in two minds about the probability of success of this venture. The traditional view is that it was utter folly. His force, though sizable, was much smaller than the armies Robert of Naples could raise. Plus, Naples had a wide network of allies and supporters across Italy that could tie up the imperial troops on their way south. Others argue that the Anjou were foreign, aka French, occupiers, and that, for instance, the city of Naples had invited Henry to come south and rid them of their troublesome king. Whether or not he had a chance, we will never know, because Henry VII on his way through Tuscany fell ill in the small town of Buonconvento, 8 miles from Siena. Either another bout of the Brescia disease, a heart attack, or simply total exhaustion put an end to all his plans. Hearing about his demise, the army dissolved. The King of Sicily abandoned his invasion of Calabria that had already captured Reggio, and the Pisan Knights brought the body of the first emperor in 60 years back to their city. It is in Pisa that he still lies, in a magnificent funerary monument. This monument, by the sculptor Tino da Camiano, is another remarkable work of this period of transition from medieval to Renaissance art. If you want to see it and you happen not to get to Pisa anytime soon, you can go see it at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Not the real thing, of course. After all, the British did not manage to steal everything. But of the stuff they could not steal, like, say, Trajan's Column, Michelangelo's David, or the Brunswick Lion, they created casts. And these casts are kept in the cast court of the V&A, which looks pretty much like the world's attic. And there, in a corner behind Giovanni and Niccolo Pisano's masterful pulpits, can you find our friend, Henry VII. Few people stop to look at him, and even fewer know who he was and what he did. And despite his ultimate failure, he played an important role in European history. His journey to Italy became the catalyst for a whole host of events. Triggered by his invasion, the Italian political landscape consolidated at breakneck speed. The distinction between Guelphs and Ghibellines gradually disappeared after he had died. Instead, most cities ceased to be republics but came under the explicit or implicit rule of just one family, with the notable exceptions like Venice. And some of these rulers, like the Visconti, the Della Scala, the Este and Gonzaga, consolidated the surrounding cities into territorial principalities that would later become duchies, and preventing the unification of Italy until the 19th century. While this process was almost inevitable given the levels of infighting and fragility in the Italian system, other outcomes were less foreseeable. One thing I've already mentioned, the papacy becoming a permanent vassal of the French crown. And that also changed the relationship between what we call today Germany and France. Up until the late 13th century, France and the Empire enjoyed mostly friendly neighborly relations, and as you may remember, France rarely featured in our narrative so far. The main conflict of the medieval emperors had been with the papacy and the Italian cities. Once the popes moved to Avignon and had come under French control, That old conflict was inherited by the French kings. So whilst Italy fades from view for the emperors, the Franco-German relationship, often positive and even more often violent, became one of the key axes of German history, culminating in the two world wars and then the reconciliation after 1949. Talking about the world wars, I have another podcast recommendation for you. There's a new World War I podcast out there called Not So Quiet on the Western Front. Yes, there are several of these, but even I, as someone who's only got tangential interest in military history, have been gripped by Dan and Spence's takes. Trained military historians both, they know their stuff. Where the rubber hits the road is when they dive into the various technologies of war and the speed of innovation the war forced into being. So far my favorite episode is the one about the Zeppelins. They describe how in 1915 Zeppelins were almost invincible and rained terror down on British cities, before rapid improvements in British technology turned them into exploding death traps for their crews. For those soldiers who travelled strapped onto the roof of the Zeppelin with their machine guns, there was literally zero chance of survival. Gripping stuff. Not So Quiet on the Western Front is available wherever you get the history of the Germans from. I also put a link into the show notes. Next week, we'll look at another one of those often overlooked emperors, Ludwig the Bavarian, sponsor of William of Ockham of razors fame, and the background, though never mentioned, of Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. I hope you will join us again.